Welcome to Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. I'm usually here with Ann Lipton, law professor now at the University of Colorado. Bet you didn't know that, Francine, who teaches and researches securities and business law. Ann's away this week. She's finishing her move to Boulder from New Orleans. Instead, we invited, as I mentioned, Francine McKenna, who's a writer, lecturer, and overall kind of observer of public accounting and corporate governance and activism and related subjects. Hi, Francine.
Hi, Mike. It's really nice to be on the podcast. And I did know that about Ann because I've known Ann for a long time.
Cool.
She's one of my go-to experts.
Oh yeah, no, she's clearly one of mine. Securities law, whatever. She's the source. So that's great. So she's in the middle of driving now. I think she's somewhere in Texas. She maybe have left Texas already, but if you've been following her, I don't know if you've been following her like on socials, but
with her cats,
she's on Blue Sky with her cats, trying to chase them down in hotel rooms. Anyway, we'll catch up with Ann next week or whenever when she's firmly back on the ground. Ann and I asked Francine to talk about kind of public accounting and how it's changing these days, and some of its controversies, some of its issues. And this is a way for investors and scholars, another perspective for them to understand what's going on, like at U.S. public companies. Francine speaks and writes extensively on these, public accounting subjects and the firms and the legal issues around it. We're going to cover all that. So we also want to explore like how she arrived at this kind of fascinating intersection of, the arcane world of public accounting and debits and credits, but also how it relates to investing and corporate governance. She has an influential newsletter called The Dig that's on Substack that explores a lot of these different angles and perspectives. And so we'll look at some of the subjects she's talked about. Before we plunge into it, just quick reminder, Shareholder Primacy has an email address. We welcome people's input. Francine, if you want to send us a complaint after you've heard this, the place to do it is at shareholderprimacy, one word, at freefloat.llc. Please send stuff to our mailbox, and we will listen to your concerns and maybe even talk about them at some point. Anyway, Francine, let's start looking at public accounting these days, kind of what's holding your attention and concerning you lately. I'd like to start by talking about the PCAOB.
Sure.
What's it stand for again? Public
Company Accounting Oversight Board.
Oversight Board. And there's like law students who listen to this occasionally. Can we get 10 seconds about where that came from?
So the PCAOB is the independent audit regulator that was created as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002. A reaction, of course,
over 20 years old, right?
Yeah, so a reaction, of course, to the Enron failure, the Arthur Andersen implosion. But what's really nice is some people writing about what's going on right now are also mentioning that Enron was not the only massive accounting fraud failure that was going on at the time. You had WorldCom, you had Health South, you had Tyco.
Oh my God.
You were on the verge of the .com era. So there was a lot going on, and frankly, a lot of it was centered around Arthur Andersen's clients. Arthur Andersen and Enron were sort of a catalyst, but they were not, the first time that anybody had ever talked about the fact that perhaps consulting had begun to dominate too much the public accounting firms, that maybe the public accounting firms had taken their eye off the ball, the audit
right,
duties.
And that the consulting business basically compromised their independence.
Right. So it became a big issue with Arthur Andersen, and there was a whole divorce and separation and creation of Accenture and Andersen Consulting, right. And so lots of different gyrations there. But there had been a lot of tension, and the tension was under the surface, had been talked about, had been discussed. And basically, the Enron failure and Arthur Andersen's failure and the ability to point to the fact that Andersen was doing so much consulting work for Enron
It was
compared to the
it was
audit.
a magnitude, a high multiple of the audit fee.
X times more in terms of fees, et cetera. So the audit was a loss leader, a afterthought, a way for the firm to just cement that relationship. And then they were more interested in all the other work. So they were doing lots of work on tax, on systems integration. They were even the internal audit co-sourcer for Arthur Andersen, which was something that then again was prohibited post Sarbanes-Oxley. So the need to have an independent regulator for the audit industry, and lots of professionals don't like you calling it an industry, but I focus on the business of the Big Four.
Yes.
So I have to talk about them as a business, as an industry, as a business model. And audit is a business model because it's mandated by the securities laws. If you are a listed firm in the US and in most developed countries, you have to have an audit by a certified public accountant or a chartered accountant or somehow registered or licensed. Once the PCAOB came on board, then you added this extra layer of that firm also had to be registered with this outside regulator. Previous to that, prior to and during my whole history, in school, et cetera, we grew up with the Big Eight. You remember the big? We started at the Big Eight, and it was a peer reviewed, self-regulated industry.
Self-regulation. I was just going to say that. Yeah. All right. So, and that system has largely. I mean, it's not foolproof, but its system has largely worked in the past 20 years. I think there's lots of criticism about whether the PCAOB is really doing as good a job as it could. But so most recently, there's been some talk about eliminating it, or what's the proposal that's out there?
From day one, the minute that the Sarbanes-Oxley law was passed, that the PCAOB was established, that they started to look at who was going to be involved to set it up, thinking about how it was going to operate, primarily to do inspections of the firms to make sure that they were following auditing standards. Okay, that's the idea. There wasn't an initial idea that they would be heavy-duty enforcement. There wasn't an idea that they would be heavy-duty involved in accounting standards because those had been created by the firms in conjunction with the AICPA, the trade association, and other professional associations. So that wasn't sort of the impetus. The impetus was we need to start inspecting the firms, inspecting those audits of certain critical clients to avoid another Enron. Okay. Nobody wanted to get caught again. The who. We won't get fooled again, right?
Get fooled again, right? Okay.
That again, our era. So we won't get fooled again. We're going to create something, and frankly, the PCAOB has been under siege by those who didn't want it around, who resent the fact that it was put in place at all, who don't like that it started really, taking its responsibility seriously for the last 22 years. And so there have been periodic times, depending on the politics of Congress and the administration, in the presidential administration, of swinging back anti-regulation, going in and saying the PCAOB is going too far, it's being too tough on the firms, it's being too tough on the partners. And I actually wrote an op-ed for the FT back in 2020, so during the first Trump administration, because there was a bill, Mr. Huizinga, and he proposed a bill back in 2020 to, again, do the same thing that they want to do now, which is fold the PCAOB theoretically back into the SEC, kind of squash all that stuff. And I said at that time, this is a really bad idea. Not only because the PCAOB had taken on its responsibility, moved forward, created a level of independence that, again, the firms and others resented.
Under a self-regulation model that they kind of needed, they were pushing against.
Yes.
Okay.
So they had done a pretty good job of that, although there were peaks and valleys. There were times when they were, in my opinion, too soft. There were times when they were ineffective. There were times when they were too political or got caught up in the political. But in general, you had a sort of a positive slope in terms of we're moving forward and we're establishing ourselves as an independent regulator who's independent of the firms, independent of sort of even the SEC, which was given significant oversight responsibility for the PCAOB. The PCAOB is a weird legal structure because it's an independent regulator. It's a DC not-for-profit corporation. Okay, it's just this weird hybrid thing. People said that it was built off of the model of FINRA, broker-dealer, broker-dealer regulation.
Sort of like how to regulate investments.
How to regulate investments.
Yeah.
So there was a whole bunch of hybrid sort of stuff thrown in a stew. And of course, then you don't end up with the perfect version of everything. And it takes time to get established. But there have been pushback on it forever and ever and ever. In fact, there was a chairman, Jim Doty, who was there for a while during the Obama administration. And as soon as things changed, right away, like he was a demon because he was pushing back and pushing hard on the firms and trying to trying
to preserve the mandate and independence.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is nothing new. The difference is that right now, you have a Congress that is controlled, 100% by the GOP, that is also very aligned with the Trump administration. It's a very anti-regulation environment. And you have now an SEC that's led by a chairman, Paul Atkins, who was at the SEC a long time ago, is a very self-admitted libertarian, anti-regulation person who during his time, since when he was at the SEC in the early 2000s, okay, so around the time when all this happened with Enron and shortly afterward, but before the financial crisis, he has been leading a consulting firm where he has been defending the big four firms.
Oh, okay.
And lobbying on their behalf. So he's very much in the camp of the firms can regulate themselves, the firms can manage themselves, the firms do not need or want or require this kind of oversight, and we don't want to be in this business.
So the PCAOB has sort of never really had in the view of the current administration, I suppose, it never really had a very necessary mandate and so forth. So we can go back to the old self-regulatory, and by moving. Are they eliminating is the proposal? I don't know what the proposal. Are they going to eliminate it? Are they going to just move it under the SEC, or what are they proposing here?
The provision that's in the reconciliation bill, the big bad bill, or whatever it's called.
Yeah, right.
Actually,
big beautiful bill.
Yeah, actually, just recently, the parliamentarian of Congress said this provision really shouldn't be in there, along with several others, because they're not budget related. The PCAOB is funded by fees to the audit firms and to the issuers. So there's no taxpayer impact from eliminating it. In fact, even Paul Atkins, the chair of the SEC, admitted that if they folded any of its activities into the SEC would need more money. Right. So.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, they can't absorb it just willy-nilly. In fact, they've been cutting so many people that they're cutting their own activities, including they've been on a long slope downward in terms of their own inspection activities, like for investment advisors. Right. They get like barely double-digit coverage of investment advisors right now. So how are they going to take on this massive inspection program that the PCAOB has built up in order to cover the firms and the number of audits and issuers that we've got, in the environment right now? So they want to. There's a bit of a charade because it says folded into the SEC, but in effect, the House bill said folded in, but clearly like we want no more enforcement and we want standards to go back to the AICPA. And fold the inspection stuff in, but there's no obviously staff or funding. And then the Senate version of the bill, which ended up being what was left, said no, SEC, you cannot ask for more money. You cannot ask for more money for anything related to the PCOB activities. So basically, it was a charade in order to eliminate it without
Right.
eliminating
So they're
it.
probably going to like maybe starve it.
Right. And now, yeah, completely starve it. And now that the parliamentarians said, well, you really can't have this provision in the tax bill unless it gets overridden 60 votes or whatever.
Right.
Now I just heard that there's new bills that are coming up to saying we're going to delegate the PCOB's responsibilities back to the AICPA, or we're going to just, completely eliminate it and forget this charade of moving it into the SEC. So
Sure.
the bottom line is that there have been, for a very long time, people who wanted to go back to self-regulation.
So this was kind of the moment.
Yes.
Where people were able
It was
to,
possible.
between DOJ, between the
Yes.
new people at the SEC, where some very long-standing opposition to the
Yes.
ideas that the
Yes.
PCAOB was kind of running with would sort of be able to take
Right.
life.
What's really funny is that the firms, especially the largest ones, although over the years have always lobbied, given campaign contributions, put political pressure via the SEC or Congress on the PCOB whenever there was something that the PCOB wanted to do that they didn't like. For example, they wanted to propose audit firm rotation, that the audit firms would
like
have to
mandatory,
rotate every
right? You can only audit.
Right.
I mean, some of these auditors have worked for the same firm for like a century or more.
100 years, right. So over the years, every time something that came up that they could block via political pressure, preempting it via some kind of legislation in Congress that showed that it would never pass, whatever, they always did that. However, they did not openly say, we want the PCOB to go away, right? That would be sort of,
a little too obvious.
A little too obvious. But because, frankly, they should not want the PCOB to go away, because over the years, over the last 20-some years, it's provided cover for the firms.
Right. That's what I can't get my head around, is that you'd think that these firms would be happy to,
Right.
I mean, it's more of a hassle and so forth, but they'd be able to sort of, blame them or sort of just shift responsibility to that. Right. Yeah.
When the PCOB was first formed, and then there was new rules that came out about internal control opinions, and that was costing everybody a lot of money. The firms were making zillions. I was doing that work when I came back from Latin America in the early 2000s when I left KPMG and Bearing Point.
Right.
So that Sarbanes-Oxley work to ensure, internal controls were in place. The firms were reaping tons, billions of dollars, and yet when their clients complained, it was like, the law is making us do this. The PCOB is making us do
this. Right, you
can
just blame them.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, hard to understand why strategically they wouldn't want something in place, but maybe they would prefer to have it within the SEC, which the SEC, the firms, the largest global firms have always had much more control over. Why? Because there's a revolving door between the firms and the SEC.
Oh, sure. Right. They assign people there. There's role. Okay. Yeah. Right.
Right. So it's interesting right now because the PCOB, getting rid of the PCOB, or basically, defanging it, deeming it completely impotent by some kind of, legislative or whatever, is really only the first step, because you have already seen various people talk about, now let's get rid of the SOX 404 internal controls.
So some of the
opinions.
underlying regulation that requires like review of controls and so forth.
Right. So there was a hearing yesterday.
That's going to go. Oh,
right. So there was a hearing yesterday, and you had Professor Bainbridge, who's a prominent law professor. You had John Coates. Coates, who's at Harvard, who was interim corporation finance director under Gensler for the first 6 months or so. They were all testifying because now Congress, they see the PCOB as a goner, one way or the other, And now they're looking and saying, now we need to go back and skewer the Sarbanes-Oxley law, everything that's left. And in particular, the 404 stuff. Frankly, I think that they want to go all the way to removing the statutory audit mandate.
Oh, wow. That would be pretty radical.
Well, it would be radical, but people who actually are on the other side of the issue, like former SEC Enforcement Director Lynn Turner, say, you know what? If we can't make it work, be careful what you wish for. Let's get rid of the mandate, laissez-faire. You buy whatever due diligence you want, and let the chips fall where they may.
I have a proposal for you, but I'm going to hold that till the end.
Okay.
Because I have an idea about how audits should work. But let's switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
I want to ask you about some more current kind of legal controversies related to accounting. And there have been a few that may even hit the Supreme Court or something like that. Let's talk about that for a little while, and then we can take a quick break, and then return to my question and a few other issues. So let's talk a little bit about litigation.
Right.
I know that there was, and again, there's other listeners here that know this more than I do. That it all started with the Omnicare decision, but then there's been some others that have kind of followed. Maybe you can kind of help us get quickly up to speed about sort of the litigation environment,
right?
At what the firms and investors are looking at.
Right. So Omnicare is one element, but before we talk about the impact of Omnicare, which talks about whether opinions are actionable under the securities laws, right? So not just auditors, but in particular auditors.
Oh, even like appraisal opinions,
appraisal
opinions,
or legal opinions, or even investment bankers saying stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit broader than that. But in the 20 years since I've been writing about these issues, so once I left public accounting consulting, my last firm was PwC. I worked for them in 2004, 2005.
Is there anyone that you haven't worked for yet? Which one?
Well, I haven't worked for Deloitte or for EY, but I worked for PwC also. And then I kind of said, I'm done, right?
Right.
And fortunately, that was right before the financial crisis came. And so then there were a lot of
08 financially, right?
Yeah. Okay, so then there were a lot of people who were asking, where were the auditors? And one of the things is, it's always been my kind of catchphrase is it's really easy to bring auditors to court, but it's very difficult to bring them to justice. Meaning, everybody, you can sue them. You can try to sue them, right? Whether it's individually as an investor, in a class action, a derivative suit, et cetera. You can sue them, but traditionally they have either settled very quickly for nominal amounts just to get that out of the way, or they have been able to defeat those lawsuits in the past because there's this sort of ethos around, it's not the auditor's job to find fraud. So the audit is not designed to detect.
Not cops.
Right. The audit is not designed to detect fraud. We're just there, right? And that was very successful for a long time. In fact, it was even successful post Sarbanes-Oxley, post Enron, post everything that happened with Arthur Andersen and all the other companies, because the legal process was sort of oriented around that. You had this sort of preconceived idea that the auditors were sort of capitalist eunuchs sitting over on the side, and that they could not possibly be corrupted by companies or by the frauds that occurred within companies. They were sitting over on the side, following their standards and doing everything right, and they were either just sort of not in the room, or they were duped. So the number one defense for the firms, if it gets to that point, is we were duped. We were given false documents.
The company, the auditee, the company willfully concealed something or misstated something, and our procedures are not designed to detect that kind of stuff.
Right. Collusive fraud in particular. And remember, executives often say, well, we followed this process, or we did this way because we were given that advice by our auditors or our lawyers.
Oh, so you have
this sort of clash of who's on first. And
Right.
the
Who's
auditors
responsible? Yeah.
have been given the benefit of the doubt by the courts, by the legal system, to say they are kind of above it all, right? They are like
Right.
these better angels who are not motivated by incentives. Well, that all changed post Enron, because we saw the amount of money that's involved in the process, the billions and billions. And when the financial crisis came, they did get sued. Okay, they did get sued, not right away, but they
Right.
did get sued for missing the extreme issues around valuations that,
Okay.
and the conflicts of interest, et cetera, et cetera. But they mostly settled. Those cases
Okay.
did not go to trial. Something changed, though, later on, because the FDIC, after a very long time, finally brought a case against one of the firms. And although it took a very long time, it was a bank that had failed during the crisis, Colonial Bank. And there was a group of lawyers, Thomas Alexander and Forster, Steve Thomas, Emily Alexander, and their colleague, and then later Steve Sorensen, who finally took a different approach, finally looked at these cases and said, let's not go through, kind of the normal way that these cases used to be brought. And let's also look at the fact that we now have this PCOB, and they're supposed to be following certain auditing standards, and they're being inspected against that. Let's look and say, did they follow the standards? Let's go piece by piece.
Okay.
And 3 cases came up all at the same time. Colonial Bank, which the FDIC finally got through all kinds of different gyrations.
All sorts of procedural, right.
MF Global, which is another Chicago case, a failure in 2011. And Taylor, Bean, and Whitaker, which was the collusive mortgage originator that was feeding fraudulent mortgages into Colonial Bank.
Application. Okay.
Right.
All right. Go ahead.
And these lawyers took on these cases, 2 of them for trustees in bankruptcy, Taylor, Bean, and Whitaker, and MF Global, and then for the FDIC as a trustee or receiver, given the bankruptcy and legal issues around Colonial Bank. And 2 of them settled. After going to trial, Colonial Bank went to trial via a judge and ended up the largest ever damages settlement against a firm,
Against
over
an accounting
$600 million against
Wow.
PwC for basically not finding the fraud. So kind of changed the game a little bit. So now we have more cases. We have cases against, again, KPMG related to the failures of the banks back in March of 2023.
Oh, that's
And-
SVB, Silicon Valley Bank.
So
Right.
Silicon Valley Bank, there's a case that Bernstein Litowitz, the plaintiff's firm, has, and they just overcame motions to dismiss, and theoretically they'll go to trial.
And that's against KPMG, you said.
That's against KPMG. And people said KPMG should not be blamed for Silicon Valley Bank, but there's very ample evidence that KPMG did squat. But these cases come back to, and a couple other ones that we were going to talk about, they come back to also this kind of bias or legal precedent of, does the auditor's opinion even matter at all? Does it
Oh, is
sway?
it like, is it relevant to like
Is it relevant to investor
decision-making?
decisions?
Is it material?
Right. And the case that people have written a lot about is a case against a next-tier firm, BDO, for AmTrust.
That's the insurance company, I think.
That's
wasn't
the
it?
insurance company.
All right.
And so right now we have a situation where it's gone back and forth, Second Circuit, appeals, et cetera. And the whole idea is that the auditor's opinion is so generic that it couldn't possibly have changed investors' opinions, even if they screwed up and completely did not
So
follow
it
the
was
standards and
completely
did a bad
immaterial
job.
to investor decision making.
Right.
So why even bother? Why are we paying for this stuff?
Right. So this is the bottom line, is that if you rest on the Omnicare decision and say, let's look at whether or not the auditor's opinion is false, knowingly false, has an impact on investors, all the different criteria under Omnicare. If you go back and you say the auditor's opinion would not have changed investors' behavior, it's pretty counterintuitive. And
Right.
the SEC actually filed an amicus brief when this case was in appeal, because it was just so flabbergasting that any court could say the auditor's opinion just doesn't matter.
It's irrelevant. Yeah, right.
Because
Wow.
the counterfactual, which your colleague Ann Lipton has written about, the counterfactual is, okay, let's say that the auditor did not issue an opinion. They could not issue an opinion. They realized that the company was going off in the wrong direction, its accounting was wrong, etc.
And they just withdrew.
And they delayed to such an extent that the company could not file. That definitely does
that's material.
Consistently
when
have a material
auditors
impact.
change,
Yes.
or when an auditor, especially
auditor
when a company
leaves,
withdraws guidance or withdraws its opinion.
Right.
Oh, you should. I mean, there's abundant evidence that totally affects share price and
major
that.
red flag.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that the attorneys, having lost this appeal, having finally, common sense prevailed that the auditor's opinion does matter. So we need to really look at, this situation and it needs to go forward. The case needs to go forward. They've actually taken the bold move of requesting certiorari at the Supreme Court to say that the fact that the auditor made this false statement that it had complied with auditing standards, which on its face we know is untrue. Why?
Yeah, right.
Because the SEC did an enforcement action against the firm for not following auditing standards, because the company had to do multiple restatements, because when the news came out in the Wall Street Journal, the stock dropped. We know that the auditor didn't do the audit properly, did not point out these issues, and when they were found out, it was a bad impact.
Right.
But they go back and they say, yeah, but the idea that the auditor, in saying whether or not they followed standards, just one little sentence in the opinion, kind of a boilerplate sentence, we followed the auditing standards. The idea that the court said that per se, this is material, that either saying they didn't follow standards, but they gave an opinion anyway, which would be completely a disaster.
That'd be wrong. Yeah, right.
Not giving an opinion because following standards, they found stuff and so they were delayed. In other words, the counterfactuals are all bad.
Yeah.
Like that following standards statement is
very relevant.
Very relevant and very full of impact.
Information,
of information, even in its generic blandness. But they've gone to the Supreme Court to say that the court that approved the appeal had gone too far and had created this massive potential that this bland statement that we followed auditing standards is per se material to investors.
When it's not,
is dramatically going to add an enormous amount of burden and liability to the firms. And it's mine is, hey,
great,
bring it
good.
on.
That's their job.
Good.
That's why they're getting paid all this money.
Yes, they need to take every single word in that opinion very, very seriously.
And it doesn't look like they do. Let's take a quick break.
Okay.
And then we can talk I want to ask a couple other things about your writing and your lecturing and so forth, but we'll do that in a minute, okay?
Sure.
And we'll come back and we'll talk with Francine about, as we said, public accounting, some corporate governance implications. We talked about litigation and other issues here at Shareholder Primacy.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFloatAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFloatAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at FreeFloatAnalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Mike Levin here talking with Francine McKenna, scholar and lecturer and observer extraordinaire of public accounting and related subjects. We've been talking about some very current issues and controversies, litigation, the PCAOB, but Francine writes about all this in a Substack newsletter called The Dig. And you can find it, I can't remember, it's thedig.substack. You can find it on Substack, it's pretty easy. Where'd you get the title? The name?
It's kind of funny. I had a legacy blog. That's how I started writing in 2006 called Ray the Auditors.
It's almost 20 years ago.
R.E. the Auditors.
Yes,
And,
Ray the Auditors.
because the idea was in reference to the auditors, and also because I anticipated that the litigation against the firms was going to end up being the most interesting thing. I wanted to talk about the business of the firms, and so I wanted to talk about the litigation. And of course, that's actually been an education and a joy for me over the years. And in between that, I started writing the blog. I then started doing a lot of freelance work. I got quoted a lot during the financial crisis. I ended up with columns at Forbes and American Banker. And then I ended up full-time at MarketWatch in Washington, D.C. And I was a full-time journalist, reporting, not a column, not opinion, but second day analysis of issues related to financial regulation, accounting, and audit regulation, but not like the technical standards. So there's a lot of publications, a lot of journalists that cover changes in accounting standards, very technical
like
stuff.
how you account for this bit of inventory, or how goodwill needs to be written off or something. Right.
So I wanted to focus, and I had to focus for MarketWatch on the investor impact, in particular when the firms got sued, or when there were significant regulatory changes, or when a particular industry like banking, when there was an overlap. So that's what I focused on, and I was at MarketWatch when this period came where PwC was facing 3 trials in an 18-month period, which was just unprecedented.
Right, and they settled this stuff usually,
Right, so they settled 2 of them mid-trial after the plaintiffs had presented their case. They folded. And then they went all the way through with the case that the FDIC brought against PwC for Colonial Bank, and they lost. And it was a record damages award.
So you're writing. You're like
writing.
You're ready.
And then the crypto era came on, and then you had firms that were dabbling in crypto. I left MarketWatch at the end of 2019. I took a little bit of time out in the woods in rural Michigan, thinking I was going to come back to DC or whatever. And instead I ended up in Philadelphia with an opportunity to teach at Wharton.
So that was your move into academia.
Well, I had been teaching the whole time in DC. The minute I got a master's degree from University of Chicago, I decided I'll apply and I'll take whatever job they want. And I ended up teaching the MBA's international business because of all my international experience in their online course at American University. Okay. But when so let's go back. When I left MarketWatch, it was primarily because there were 2 stories that I had been spun around and they would not publish. 2 stories related to fraud and the firms that they would not publish. One was a follow-up story to a Disney whistleblower allegation regarding fraud at Disney. And the second one was about Under Armour, which at that time was under both SEC and DOJ investigation related to accounting fraud issues.
And you wrote this stuff up.
I wrote the stuff up.
And you did all the reporting. And,
yes.
Okay.
And they were hesitating. And the reason is because journalism, media is very allergic to the F word. Okay? And I don't mean fraud. The one that President Trump just used. I mean the fraud word. Yes. And even saying, why are they being investigated? Here's what other companies who've done similar things in the past, why they were, investigated, or why they ended up getting enforcement actions or criminal liability, et cetera. They didn't like that. So I decided, I had been courted by Substack. They had started, back in 2018, people I knew who started it. And they said, anytime you're ready, anytime you're ready. I never got any money or support from them, like a lot of some of the journalists.
Some of the big writers got grants or got some stipends from them.
What I had is I realized there was finally a turnkey platform that allowed you not just to write as I had been doing on Read the Auditors on a WordPress blog, but to write and have a paywall. And it was all integrated now, and it was very smooth. And so you could set up that,
you could collect a little money for your writing that way. And
if
a lot of people have
independent.
followed you into this and figured that out.
So when I left MarketWatch in 2019, the Under Armour story was the first one I put up. I never got sued.
So it's probably still there.
It's still
we
there.
Probably go find it. Oh,
it's
wow.
Still there.
And
they ended up with SEC enforcement action, but they ended up having the criminal charges dropped.
Oh, wow. All right.
But you asked about the name.
Yes.
I wanted to differentiate it from the previous legacy blog. I wanted to come up with something quick and easy. And basically, people had always said to me, man, you are just, always digging in the dirt. You're always digging into this stuff. You go dig where people are, other people are afraid to dig. You're not afraid to make digs at the firms. You're independent.
Right.
You don't get a pension from them, or I'm never going to go back and work for them. So
me neither.
The dig just seemed like a very evocative name. And I had my nephew was a graphic artist student.
I saw it. There's like a little
make a little steam shovel, whatever, whatever. And fortunately, it's been sort of easy to stick with that and use it, in a hopefully not too overwhelming punish way to say, I am trying to dig in and do what I did at MarketWatch, which is write not what everybody else writes, but write what I know and what I have to bring to the table, which is seasoned by having been inside the firms, two firms, at a P&L level. And
also observing many, many different examples of their work and their misconduct and so forth.
In particular at PwC, I was in the internal audit of the firm itself.
They do that.
And in 2005, it was critically important because they were still kind of getting organized around how to respond to this new independent regulator, the PCAOB. So building up the infrastructure, which the largest firms had to do because they were going to be inspected on an annual basis. They were going to have to build up data, systems, reporting, infrastructure, to be in constant scrutiny.
From this regulator.
From this new regulator.
That had never happened before. Right. Yeah.
Right. And so I was there at a time where, in particular, we looked at the firm's response to issues around independence, auditor independence, and also around sort of partner matters and consultation. So when an audit partner would call the national office and say, I need some help.
I have a question about this, how you treat this transaction or something.
The client is pushing back. We want to do this. How can we find a way? So those are the three issues that I focused on while I was at PwC. And so I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that the newsletter was going to focus on original reporting. It was going to be original information that hopefully investors and others might find useful. And I found also that some of my more prolific subscribers are the law firms on both sides.
The ones who are defending or going after.
And the ones,
interesting.
Right, and the ones, because they're looking for ideas. So while I was at MarketWatch, I had a story about revenue recognition, ghost revenue. So a weird situation where a company had acquired another company and they had to write off some deferred revenue, but they were bringing it back in as alternative metrics.
So just making it up again.
Just making it up. And so I wrote about that story, and it ended up being a whistleblower saw it. They didn't like it because they were told they weren't going to get paid for their sales because they had to write them off. And then they realized by my story, the company was bringing it back in so the top executives could get paid.
They were taking credit for it without compensating the sales guy.
Right. And it ended up being a whistleblower brought it, and it ended up being a class action, and it was a case against a particular company, and Bernstein Litowitz got $70 million out of the
cool.
company. And
All right.
so, so there was a really good opportunity to kind of focus on some stuff that other people didn't have time or didn't have the support of their editors to do at mainstream media, and I didn't have anybody I had to answer to.
Right, and that's the mission. All right, so I have a question for you, then we're going to have to wrap up. All right, and it's a question I've wondered about for a long time. I'm going to assert that the very best way from an economics perspective, and you'll have to hear my reasoning in a minute, for financial audits to proceed would be for the auditors, for the external auditors, to be retained by or work for, wait for it, the SEC. Okay? So right now, auditors are selected and hired by the boards of directors of companies, the audit committee, if you will. All right. So, and there's all sorts of conflicts there. That's what we've been talking about. Okay. That the best way to eliminate those conflicts is to have the government in the form of the SEC do the hiring of the auditor. And there's a very specific reason why. The economist in me sees this. Okay. That the financial information, audited financial reports and an opinion meet the classic definition of a public good. Okay, meaning it's non-exclusive. My use of it, my reading of an audit opinion doesn't prevent you from reading it, and it doesn't diminish it. So my use of it doesn't make less of it available. It's financial information. So financial information in the form of audited financials are a public good. Well, the best way to provide classic public good, just like roads or an army, is through public provision, is for the investing public, instead of having it done privately, which you talked about a little while ago, that we're starting to get to a place where maybe private provision of financial information would be where we end up. That the best way would be for the SEC to either do it themselves and hire 300,000 auditors and just assign auditors all over the country to public companies, or alternatively to have the big four and the next tier and everybody work for the SEC in possibly a rotational world or whatever, that they have to bid on it. Okay. So that's my idea.
So let me stop
for providing
you.
Audited financial information, and I'm guessing you don't like it, but I want to know why.
Let me stop you right there.
Go ahead.
I will say that you are brilliant, because I had the same idea back during the financial crisis, and I made up a little acronym called Service Corps for Accountability and Transparency. Maybe it was the acronym that didn't work, because that comes out SCAT, But anyway,
okay.
And the reason why we think this way is because no matter what the PCAOB or the SEC or any regulator in any country does, as long as the firms are paid by the companies, by the issuers, you have an inherent conflict. The payment process, just like rating agencies, okay?
Yeah,
which
exactly.
came under an enormous amount of scrutiny during the crisis, but the firms,
for their
but the
rating
firms,
mortgages,
right? But the audit firms escaped it, and so that payment process is the reason why Lynn Turner, who we mentioned earlier, says, screw it, let's just eliminate the mandate. But I don't agree with eliminating the mandate completely, because I think that throws retail investors under the bus.
We need audit. I mean,
right.
I'm not a retail investor, but we need the assurance.
So why do we need that?
Opinions, but they know that they're there.
Right. So why do we need that? And the thing is that big investors, institutional investors, and a good example is Theranos. Theranos did not have an audit. Okay, when it was found to be a fraud. Company. Okay, right. It was not a public company, but it did not have audits. But lots and lots of people who are involved in public companies, like Rupert Murdoch and Larry Ellison and the Walton family, who run public companies and know what auditors do, invested their money and did not demand an audit, and there wasn't one, right? So they showed their colors, because they said, we don't want an audit to stand in the way of us getting involved in companies that have a trajectory, and we don't want to know the bad news. We don't want the market to know the bad news because we want to plan our entrance and exit without having actual information. But what does that do? What happens is you don't have good financial information coming out. You have no one making sure that the companies are not lying or manipulating the financial information.
Yeah.
And you completely destroy the integrity of the investment environment for 401k, for pensions, for the average retail investor, or even for the investor who does not have the critical mass or the means in order to demand that the company that they invest in create enough due diligence, pay for that due diligence. So my idea was not the SEC, because I think that the SEC is a highly politicized organization.
Yeah, it is.
It's way too beholden to the firms. My idea was the GAO to be that procurement organization who would sign the contracts, mandate the audits, and then create
set their standards,
then create a best of all. So draw from all the firms, depending on the company, depending on the issues, depending on the industry and needs, etc. Draw from the firms who still have the people, still got paid, but basically created expertise, created experience.
Okay.
Without having that direct connection to the company. So we had the same idea. I would love to see that.
I didn't see that coming. Okay.
But the reason why it doesn't happen is because there's an enormous sort of independent small business mentality in the accounting industry, the audit industry. Right. We think about the big firms, but actually the bulk of the work for everything other than the largest firms is done by small firms with one or two partners, founders, guys who feel that they're small business owners.
Right.
And they look at a solution like ours as communism.
It's just a government overreach.
Right. So it's completely antithetical to the movement that we're seeing now, which is only have government involved in the things that are going to make money for me, where I can get the contracts, and get it out of the stuff that stands in my way to do things without any guardrails or any controls or any responsibility or transparency.
Right. Wow. All right. So
So we're on the same thing.
I feel a little more reassured.
So maybe we just need another. Once they get rid of the PCOB, if they get rid of 404 internal controls, if somebody starts saying only like banks need to have certified audits, the audit firms, the largest firms, will start focusing where they have wanted to for a long time, which is on consulting, advisory, tax, etc.
Right.
And you will have just a bare minimum, and then you will have a massive
there'll be more failures than anyone can cope with.
And maybe we'll have another
There'll be a
catalyst.
There'll be a backlash to that.
Which, if you and I are alive to see it, will maybe bring in the GAO or an independent government agency
somebody to really do a better job.
Yes.
All right, cool. Wow, this has been just unbelievably good. I am so pleased we had a chance to talk about all this stuff. But we're going to have to probably bring this to a close. So thanks again. We'll have to talk more. Maybe we can get Ann and the three of us can have another conversation sometime soon. How's that sound?
That would be wonderful. And if anybody comes to me as a new subscriber to the Dig from this podcast, I will give you a 3-month comp, so you can take a look around before you decide to pay. I'm not cheap.
Right. Oh, yeah. So you've heard that now, everybody. If you heard about the Dig for the first time right here, let Francine know, and she'll give you a few months to review it. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Cool. This is Shareholder Primacy, hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin. I'm an independent activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situations. Francine McKenna is a writer and lecturer on public accounting and related corporate governance subjects. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com and Francine at info@Francine McKenna, one word, McKenna spelled McKenna.com. Our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Float Media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.